Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us here. I'm Jeff Urban. I'm with the Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum here in Hyde Park, New York, and we are so delighted that you're able to participate with us here today in what we think is a very important and groundbreaking conference. Today, we are joined with our partner, the Jewish Federation of Dutchess County, and I want to welcome Karen Hawkhouser to just say a couple of words. Welcome.
Well, thank you. And good morning, everybody. My name is Karen Hawkhouser, Executive Director of the Jewish Federation of Dutchess County. On behalf of the Jewish Federation, I am honored and humbled to be here to welcome you all on this momentous occasion. The Never Again is Now Educators Conference. We've collaborated with FDR Library and Museum on various events. However, this one is particularly timely, of critical importance and impact. With the rise of hate and anti-Semitism globally, it's important now more than ever to understand the context and precursors of what happened in the past and how to work together to prevent it from ever happening again. The idea of this conference started with a small discussion from our board member, Jonah Ritter, after one Yom HaShoah event, who wanted to ensure, as we all do, that the lessons and stories of the past could be passed from generation to generation in an effort to ensure that history would not repeat itself. The seeds of that idea grew to the tree we are here today with the FDR Library, and we look forward to this being the beginning step. So thank you, Jonah, and happy birthday. And thank you to our whole committee for their dedication and effort to make this happen today. Just as a little side plug, to find out more events of what we're doing and articles and happenings, please feel free to visit us at www.jewishdutchess.org. So we welcome all participants today to learn, laugh, and cry, but most of all, thank you for being here. And thank you, Jeffrey.
Well, thank you, Karen. So a couple of housekeeping things before we get started. The sessions are going to start at the top of the hour and run for approximately 45 minutes. Then we'll have a 15-minute break for folks to get some coffee, go to the bathroom, take phone calls, check email and such, and then we'll begin again at the top of the hour. We ask that please everyone be respectful and stay on topic for each session. The presenters have put together some great presentations for you, and we want to make sure that we stay focused on the topic that's at hand. Obviously, hate speech will not be tolerated, and things that appear in the comments or on air that are deemed to be inappropriate or go against the rules or the spirit of today's conference will be blocked. So just be aware of that. You can also, those of you that are watching, if you have to cut out, we know it's a long day and people are going to be cutting in and out throughout the day. These are being recorded. They will be made available on the website. And so be aware of that. Also, if you go to our YouTube channel, we have some programs from a larger conference that we had here about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago, which was an international conference looking at the resources that are available and in the various archives around the world to teach about the Holocaust. So our conference today is kind of boiling a lot of that down so that it's more useful for you folks who are teachers. So we'll have a series of sessions throughout the day. And you're welcome to ask questions of the presenters at the end. You can do that either by raising your hand and or chatting in, putting it in the chat as you'd like to do for that. So today's concept and conference has got three overarching themes. The first theme is the Lador of Ador, the idea of passing information from one generation to the next. This is what you guys do in the classroom every single day, right? You teachers, this is what it's all about. It's about getting the next generations prepared for the challenges that they are going to face. One of the best ways of doing that, of course, is to look to the past, to see where we've had experience with things in the past, to see what has happened in the past, and to learn those lessons. Now, some people say history repeats itself. And I don't necessarily believe that. I believe that history echoes. right? History never comes back in exactly the same way, but there are echoes of history that come back. And that's why we need to be very careful about learning those lessons and passing those lessons on to the next generation. And the next 5 years or so is going to be a very important time, in sort of Holocaust history, because the survivors, the folks with the firsthand experience of the horrors of what happened, are leaving us each day and passing on. And so we will soon be missing the authentic firsthand voice of folks that went through this terrible time. And that's really important that we capture that. It's really important that we're able to pass that on to the next generation. So that's our first theme. Our second theme is this idea of civic engagement and understanding. We need to be aware of what is going on around us in the media, in our government, in our communities, because you don't have to look far to see, elements of hate creeping in, elements of prejudice creeping in. And we need to be vigilant about that and take a look at that in our own communities, in our own places of work, in our places of worship, in our schools. And we need to be aware that we have to be on guard against that. And much of the Holocaust really, I think, occurred as a systematic breakdown of civic institutions and civic engagement. The Nazis came in and they systematically began to shut off the civic institutions, the civic engagement, the civic avenues that could have acted as a bit of a bulwark to what it was that they were doing. And we need to be on guard against that as well. And then the third theme is this idea of community. And one of the things that we're hoping to do here today with our friends at the Jewish Federation and all of you out there in your classrooms across the country is to create a community, a place here where we're all in this together, right? Each of us is talking about the Holocaust each and every day. Each of us knows that this is a very difficult thing to talk about. Each of us knows that there are other narratives out there that are not correct, that are making their way into the classrooms and such. And what we need to do is be able to present the facts, present the evidence, and present the the focus on making sure that we learn the appropriate lessons. It's easy when you're out there in the classroom every day to feel alone, to feel as if you're the only one doing that. You're not. You have this wide community of people across the country here at the Roosevelt Presidential Library with our friends at the Jewish Federation. And what I would like to do is to build this community over the course of the next couple of years so that we can share information back and forth, we can share experiences back and forth, and we can really begin to get into that brotherhood and sisterhood of moving this information forward. Now, we have 10 essential questions that you saw on the website that we're going to be taking a look at today. I won't go over those, but it's the classic things of how did this happen? Why wasn't more done? How do we prevent it from happening again? And that's really important stuff to keep in mind. But when we were putting this conference together, we thought, well, how do we begin? Where do we start? And we came up with this idea of doing a short little clip of students, getting a sense of what they know, testing their temperature as it was. And I'd like to show the short film that we put together. So Dean, could you roll that, please?
I've heard of it once before, but I don't know what the meaning of it is.
The Holocaust was this awful thing back in the 1940s where the Nazis would go around killing Jews.
I don't know what the Holocaust is.
I'm pretty sure it was when a lot of people were like imprisoned because they were Jewish.
It was a mass genocide of the Jews from 1941 to 1945, I think. And basically, all the people who were Jewish were discriminated. They were discriminated against and killed.
Put in concentration camps.
Where they were like tortured and ridiculed, I guess.
How do you know so much?
Because he's smart.
I don't really know all the details, but it would probably be something I'd say to do with like
Jewish people.
The Holocaust was like when the Germans captured all the Jews and put them in a camp under Hitler.
An event where people had to hide and stuff because they were Jewish.
I don't really know much about the Holocaust, but I do know that it was a bad thing started by Hitler.
I don't know what the Holocaust is. I mean, I heard the word, but I'm just not really sure the definition.
In the curriculum, I don't really I've never heard a teacher really talk about the Holocaust. I don't remember the last time anybody has talked about the Holocaust actually.
Hi, I'm Josh Aaronson, the director of Orchestra of Exiles, which is one of many films I've made, but one that's particularly relevant for this conference and this time, because it's about the founding of the Palestine Symphony Orchestra in 1936, which came about by moving fired Jews from Central Europe to Palestine in the time of the Nazis. What's relevant about that is the education it brought to me. Because when I was your age, all you guys who just spoke, I was like you. I knew very little about the Holocaust. I mean, I was born to parents who were Jewish, and we had no Holocaust victims in our family, fortunately, but my father was very, very attuned to it. And although I understood it, certainly, and I'd seen pictures, and we came from an educated environment, I really never got any Holocaust education. I really didn't understand what the depth of it was, other than visceral images that I saw, as you've probably seen as well. But without the education, without the push to really understand the roots of it and the depth of the evil of it, it's very, very difficult to conceive of it. So I think one of the reasons for this conference, and the reason I'm delighted to be part of this, is to sort of provide tools and to provide motivation for all the educators here, and from each one to another one to another one, from each school to another school, and it spreads the importance of Holocaust education. It's something we have to address. It's something that has to be pushed very hard because for generations we haven't done it properly, and it's a crime. So I'm here to support that effort and applaud you all for coming. Thank you very much.
So that was just a random sample of some students that we have here in the Hudson Valley and their information and knowledge of the Holocaust. I mean, clearly we see there is some information, there is some misinformation, and there is some lack of information. And we're not here to blame the students. We're not here to blame the teachers. We understand that there's a job that needs to be done. And that job of learning the lessons of the Holocaust, applying them to today, begins right now, right here with this conference. So I am delighted to introduce our first session. And you guys feel free to go to about 5 of, if you'd like, because we've eaten into a little bit of your time. Our first session is bringing Holocaust lessons to life. Descendants of survivors share memory, legacy, and responsibility. And this is with our good friends Paula and David Reckous of 3G New York. It's an educational organization that brings together 3 generations of descendants of Holocaust survivors to educate diverse communities about the perils of intolerance. And as living links, these survivors build personal connections with students and the stories and the lessons of the Holocaust. So we know as teachers and educators that when you make it personal, that's when it really sticks. So Dave Reckous is the executive director of 3GNY, and he's here along with his mom. So we're walking the walk and talking the talk when we're talking intergenerational here, and they're going to share with us some information about their organization. So I turn it over to you guys.
Thank you, Jeff. My name is Paula Reckos. Good morning, everybody. I grew up in the home of Holocaust survivors from Poland. My mother survived the war together with her parents, hidden for 2.5 years by a very generous non-Jewish family. My father managed to leave Poland and join the Russian army. I was fortunate to grow up with both of my maternal grandparents, but none of my would-be aunts, uncles, cousins, or any other distant relatives survived, nor did my paternal grandparents. I don't think I was aware of my parents' experience until I was around 11 years old. As a child, I was aware of the whispers of things I was not supposed to hear in a language I didn't understand. And I never understood my grandmother's tears as she lit the candles on Shabbat and Jewish holidays. These were supposed to be happy occasions, but they always had this element of sadness. When my mother began to tell her story to us, although she censored it for us to a certain degree, she never really hid her anger, her bitterness, or her hatred of anything Polish or German. And she was really good at expressing her vehemence and anger openly. My mother was actually never one to hide her feelings or her opinions, and she was always brutally honest about everything. In contrast, my father spoke of his experiences and his pre-war life only a few times without really revealing very much. He was never able to go there, which makes me very sad today. It's virtually impossible to process and wrap your head around this kind of suffering, inflicted on your parent and his or her family. I was emotionally obsessed with it, yet really unable to comprehend it. As a child and young adult, I adopted my mother's anger and bitterness as my own, and I would recount her history, our history, with pride in our legacy mixed with a very significant amount of venom. I'm only now beginning to really understand how being a second-generation survivor shaped me as an individual. It took me a very long time, I'm talking like 50 years, to separate my own feelings from hers. I seldom asked the questions of either of my parents, and certainly not of my grandparents, that one would expect a child of survivors to ask. I think the answers were so uncomfortable and so unfathomable that instead I just avoided the subject and wanted them to move on with their lives. As a matter of fact, I always wanted to be present when my mother told her stories to my children when they were young. I did not want her to poison their worldview. Excuse me. I didn't want her to poison their worldview and instill her venom in them. In the late 90s, after both of my grandparents and my father were no longer alive, my mother's second husband, an American-born GI, was instrumental in encouraging her to document her history and tell her story. Thanks to him, we have what in our family is referred to as Bubby's manuscript. I constantly and continually print dozens of copies and share them with whomever would like to read it, encouraging them to pass it along to someone else when they've finished. In the beginning, my mother was reluctant to speak to groups of students, but with time she began to understand the impact that recounting her personal experience could have. She first spoke at Dutchess Community College with the encouragement of Dr. Werner Steger, professor of history and genocide studies. From there, she progressed to speaking to groups of high school students and junior high students. And at the age of 97, my mother told her story to about 100 fourth through sixth graders here in Poughkeepsie. Their apt attention and intelligent questions were incredible. I have never seen her so moved by her audience and happy that she had agreed to speak to children that young. And I have to tell you that both of us were very nervous about what was going to come out of her mouth in view of the fact that the children were that young. Her telling of her story evolved over time and she became more comfortable telling it. And as she understood the impact it had on her audience, she completely understood the difference between learning this history through an eyewitness account as opposed to a history textbook. In a way, retelling the story helped to turn her horrific experience into something that could have a positive effect and help to smooth the edges of her anger and bitterness. It was a mutually beneficial endeavor. From my own perspective, accompanying her on many of her talks was therapeutic for me. It was always easier to hear her story as she told it to others, as opposed to her speaking directly to me. And I think this is a universal problem that second-generation survivors have. We are too emotionally close to the storyteller. I had noticed over the years, not without a bit of envy and self-criticism, that my children were much better at asking the right questions, listening to the answers, and passing them along than I ever was. Being one generation removed, grandchildren of survivors seem to be much better equipped to be able to tell the important stories and transmit the legacy than we are. So I cannot express how proud and thankful I am. This is a proud mama. For programs like 3GNY, and of course my son David, for keeping their grandparents' stories alive in the hopes of making the world a better place for all of us. And with that, I will turn it over to my absolute favorite middle son, David Reckous, the Executive Director of 3GNY. Thank you.
Thanks, Mom. Did a beautiful job. And for everyone watching, don't worry, my mom has cried at every time she's had to talk about any of us. That's par for the course. But really, it's such a treat and an honor to be paired with my mother to share with all of you a little bit about my journey to 3GNY, my responsibility that I feel to tell my family's story, and to share with you some of the resources that I now help coordinate through 3GNY that are available to you as educators to help continue telling the stories. So thank you to all of you for being here this morning. Thank you to Jeff and the FDR Library for setting this up, and the Jewish Federation of Dutchess County. And as I'm talking, or after my mom's talk, if any of you have questions or comments, feel free to put them in the chat and we will try to get to as many of them as we can at the end. But I want to tell you a little bit about how I got to 3GNY and how I got to this place of being willing to and able to tell my grandmother's story. And there's a little bit of, or maybe a lot of, the Yiddish word beshert, which means fate, in how I came to this place in this position. As my mom mentioned, her experience growing up was very different than mine when it comes to knowing about my grandparents' stories. I always knew that my grandmother was a Holocaust survivor. I don't ever recall a time where that was taught to me or where it was new information or anything like that. Every story that I heard had either before the war or during the war or after the war, it was always about where we are in relation to the war. And I knew that the Holocaust was a crucial part of who my grandmother was. And I came to understand that it was such an important part also of who my mother, my siblings, my whole family, who we are as individuals and as a family. Because we've mentioned my grandmother and our family so much, I want to show you just a quick picture of her, and I have a few photos to share. So that is my grandmother, second from the right, along with my mom, myself, my wife Sarah, and my two kids, Owen and Anya. And the last time that I saw my grandmother, she passed away last January, just before the pandemic really got rolling. But the last time I saw her was right after she had given that talk to the 4th and 5th graders in Poughkeepsie. She drove up, I live in Syracuse, she drove up here the next day, and I was blown away by her enthusiasm about the talk, the impact it had on her, and how impressed she was at the 4th and 5th graders' ability to pay attention to her, to understand her through her accent. They asked really insightful questions that she knew meant that they were following along with her and that they were taking something important from her presentation. And her joy, I guess is the word you would call it, her gratitude at the ability to connect with students from a different background, from a different time of life, a different generation, was so powerful to me. As an adult and as an educator myself, I had shared some of her stories with colleagues, with friends. I've given 1 or 2 talks at my synagogue, but I'd never really done anything formal with her story or with my place as a grandchild of a survivor, of multiple survivors. Even my kids, who are now 11 and 13, they also always knew that she was a Holocaust survivor, that their family has several Holocaust survivors in it, but they didn't really know the details. And I would try a little bit and she would talk to them, but it never really stuck as far as I could tell. So fast forward to the beginning of last school year. My grandmother had been gone for several months, and I went to curriculum night at my son's 7th grade, and his English teacher told us that during the course of the year, they would be reading The Devil's Arithmetic by Jane Yolen. I remember reading that as a kid myself, and I knew right away that this was my chance. This was the opportunity that I've been looking for, of forcing myself to pick up that responsibility and that legacy and find a way to share our family stories with my son and with his peers and his classmates. And here's where Bashert comes in. Literally that next week after the conference, I got an email from a friend of mine at our synagogue notifying me about 3GNY and about a course that 3GNY runs that is called We Do, which stands for We Educate, that helps grandchildren of survivors, that's what 3G stands for, the third generation of survivors, to learn how to tell their story in order to share with students. So I signed up right away and very quickly got into the course and got really excited for it. And within those next few weeks, also found myself applying for and stepping into the role as the executive director of 3GNY. 3GNY is, as I said, is an organization founded by and for third generation survivors, so grandchildren of survivors, but not only for grandchildren, it's also for other descendants of survivors and our other supporters and interested folks. And really with the mission of being an educational organization to use our family stories to help prevent future intolerance and hate, and to carry our legacy of the Holocaust forward to future generations. And so, like I said, the We Do class, I jumped right in. I dove into kind of figuring out how and what parts of my grandmother's story I could tell that would help leave an impact for students. And so I'd like to share with you just a little bit about what I share with students. And I have I've been able to share in middle schools, high schools, at community organizations already. And it's a really personal but powerful connection that I get to make with students about my family and my grandmother. So this is my grandmother. And this is how I introduce her to students. I show them this picture. You can see the vibrancy in her. That's me on the left, my brother Jacob on the right. And I use this as a way to introduce students to her as I knew her, the spunky, funny storyteller who would talk your ear off at a moment's notice. She's a great dancer. She's just a really good person to know that everyone loved talking to. And I also use it as a chance to start building in some history, because we called her Bubby or Bubby Sarah. And so I use that as a way to introduce the language of Yiddish, which many students either have never heard of or don't know much about. And it provides a way to teach some context about Europe before the war, about Jewish culture, and by way of introducing my grandmother. I then share with them a little bit about what her childhood was like and about how she noticed anti-Semitism increasing in Lublin, Poland, where she was raised. And I show them this picture, which I love this picture. When I found this several years ago, my wife actually found it and showed it to me. I was like, can you believe this is Bubby? It's a gorgeous picture, but it was taken soon after the war. And sometimes I ask students to think about why the earliest picture I have of her is after the war, when she was already in her early 20s. Because so much of her life, her history, her memories were stolen from her by the acts of the Nazis and their corroborators. And so I explain what life was like for her and how in the beginning of the war, she and her family were forced into the ghetto in Lublin, how her older brother was arrested and kept in prison. And eventually we get to the fall of 1941, when the construction of the Majdanek concentration camp was nearly complete, that some of her townspeople had helped build, and Bubby Sarah was 19. And early one morning, Nazis pulled all of the Jews out of their homes and into the village square. And Bubby Sarah was there, Her parents were there. Her younger brother, who was 17 at the time, was there. Her cousins were there. And her boyfriend, Yehuda. I tell them a little bit about her boyfriend because I think that's really interesting. And so do the teenagers. But her boyfriend, Yehuda, was there physically carrying his own mother because she had recently broken her leg and couldn't walk, but he knew that she had to come with them. And hundreds of other Jews were there together. And the Nazis marched them all at gunpoint out to the outskirts of the village, in through the gates, into the concentration camp. And Bubby Sarah said that she could hear the gate slam shut, the locks click into place. And she described feeling helpless and cold. And they were all marched into a building, which may have been that building in the top middle picture there, and crammed into two big empty rooms like the one in the top left. And it wasn't until many years later that Bubby Sarah realized that those rooms were the Maidanic gas chambers, where tens of thousands of Jews would later be murdered. So that day, around 3 that afternoon, her boyfriend Yehuda brought Bubby Sarah a small piece of bread and a little piece of news. He had been walking around the room and he was talking to one of the guards who had told him that that night at midnight, the guard would open the gate to the camp, pretend to look away, and anybody who wanted to could try to run through and escape. Now, I often ask kids, like, what do you think possessed that guard to risk his own safety to allow some Jews to escape? Was he being kind? Was he being compassionate? Was he having pity on the Jews? Or was it something else completely? I have no way of knowing. I have no way of finding out who that person was or what was motivating them. But after 3 minutes, the guard said he would have to close the gate and release his 7 dogs to go chase down anyone who had escaped. Now, he told Yehuda that everyone who stayed in the camp would most likely be dead soon. So his recommendation to Yehuda was verschwinden, which means disappear. So Bubby Sarah and her family debated whether they should try to run. Her father was adamant. He said, I am not going to sit in this camp and just wait to die. I'd rather die trying. I'm going for it. And her mother agreed. And her younger brother couldn't imagine being separated from his parents. So it was only Bubby Sarah who was unsure. She looked to Yehuda to get his advice. What do you think we should do? But Yehuda had already made up his own mind. He said, I can't leave. My mother can't run, and she needs me here. But you have to try. Imagine having to make a choice like that. What would you do? I know that my Bubby really loved Yehuda, but she needed to be with her family, and she knew that this was their best chance at surviving. And so they decided that the 4 of them would run. They would split up as soon as they made it through the gates, and they knew of a Polish Catholic family who lived in the village nearby that had been friendly before, and they hoped maybe would help them again now. Once they got there, they could regroup and figure out what comes next. So with their plan set, Bubby Sarah's aunt approached them, holding her 5-year-old on her hip. She said, I can't run. There's no way I'll make it. But you will survive, and you need to take my Yosele with you. So Bubby and her family again debated what to do. Could they take him? Would they be able to keep him quiet as they ran through the woods all night? Could he even keep up? They knew that if they left Yosele behind, he would most likely be killed. But if they took him with them, they started to realize it would surely spell capture and death for all of them. I sometimes wonder what I would do in that situation, and I get stuck because there are no good answers. So they told Aunt Mira that no, they couldn't take her son. As hard as it was, this was the only way that they'd have any chance of escape. Many years later, when I would talk with Bubby Sarah, she would tell me that she kept seeing young Yosele's face in her dreams, especially as she got older and older. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had turned her back on him. Even though she knew that it was the only decision she could have made, it still bothered her. So as nighttime fell, the room grew quiet and darkness took over, and Bubby huddled close with Yehuda, hugging, kissing, and saying goodbye. And at midnight, true to his word, the guard opened the gate. He said, "Good luck," and he turned away. The crowd surged towards the gate, and Bubby Sarah felt Yehuda literally pushing her towards the gate out of the camp. In the rush, she got separated from her parents and from her brother, and she told me later that she heard screams and the barking of dogs. And one thing she knew is that she would much rather be killed by a bullet than torn apart by a dog's jaws. So she just ran into the night, into the woods. And as morning was breaking, Bubby Sarah made it to the Catholic family's house. Fortunately, she was relieved to find that her parents and her brother had made it there ahead of her, and that the family welcomed them in, gave them some food, told them they could stay just for a day or two to figure out their next plan. And I don't know much about this family either. I don't know who they were. I don't know their names. I don't know why they chose to risk their lives to help some Jews escape. But I know in my heart that without their help, Bubby Sarah and her family would never have made it out alive. So Bubby often talked later in life about how her outlook changed once they had escaped Majdanek. She knew that so many others would never make it out alive, not her young cousin Yosele, not her boyfriend Yehuda. She felt that she had been given this extraordinary chance to stay alive, and it filled her with a will to go on, to fight for her life, to make sure that her survival was worth it. Now, I've shared this story in dozens of classrooms already, and from there, I then talk about how Bubby and her family made it to Warsaw, and yet another Catholic family welcomed them in and hid them, as my mother said, for 2.5 or 3 years. We talk about what that was like. And eventually, when the war ended, how they made it back to Lublin, how she met the person who became my grandfather, and eventually made it to New York City to start from scratch. That story, my story, our story, is just one story. It's one individual life, one individual family, one example of how people survived through the unthinkable and found a way to rebuild and create a new life. And what I found in 3GNY and in our We Do class and our program is that there are so many individual stories, each one different, each one moving, each one touching, and each one has an impact on people who hear it because it helps personalize the history books and the documentaries and the things that students learn in school. It takes what they have been hearing about or learning about the Holocaust, and it gives it a face, gives it a name. It gives it someone who's standing in front of them, whether it's virtually or in person, saying, I know this person, and this person has family who were in that thing I just read about in my book. And it makes it real in a way that has really powerful impact on students. And so we have, over the last 10 years or so, we've trained over 350 volunteer speakers like me, other grandchildren, who have stories of their family that they are willing and eager and love the opportunities to share with students. Most of the audiences that we share with are middle school or high school, although there have been some upper elementary school students that we've shared with and other community group settings as well. And with a large speakers bureau that we also have the ability to kind of match and tailor speakers' stories with particular classrooms. So if you are in a classroom that's studying a particular angle on the Holocaust, or just read a book or watched a movie that has some particular themes or events, sometimes we can find a 3G speaker who can share something that relates to that specific content piece. One of the things that I love about working with 3GNY is getting to hear all these stories and helping grandchildren learn how to frame their story in a way that is going to be compelling and going to resonate with today's students. And one of the things that I also love is that we get to offer these resources, these guest speakers to classrooms for free. So if you are a teacher or an administrator or work with people or know folks who are in classrooms, please let them know that we are available. Our goal is just to get as many stories as we can in front of as many students as we can to help them understand the realness, the impact of the Holocaust, and to build that empathy and connection by telling a human story about what happened. The power of story to build empathy is incredible. We also know that that studies have shown that Holocaust education helps students be more tolerant, be more comfortable with people of other backgrounds and different races, and especially when it's paired with testimony, with individual stories like the ones that I shared, that it helps students be more willing to stand up and challenge intolerant behavior. It makes them more likely to act as upstanders because they have that empathetic understanding of what it must have felt like or what it still feels like to be a descendant of a survivor. So as you are, as we all are working to address intolerance, bigotry, bullying, hatred of all kinds, we want to let you know of our availability and willingness to be part of that program for you and your students. I will put some of our contact information in the chat as well. And I really do hope that I get to hear from as many of you as possible. I also want to let you know that our speakers, so we are 3G New York. So we are based in and around New York City, but our speakers span a larger geography. And so we have speakers across Long Island, Westchester, the Hudson Valley, other parts of New York State and New Jersey, as well as other states. And so as more and more speakers and schools open up and allow people to be back in person, there is the possibility of having in-person guest speakers come to your class. And virtual technology has been really helpful for us in this way because it allows our speakers to visit your classroom anywhere. And we've had a lot of success with virtual presentations that are a little different than watching a video because it's still a live interaction and students still get to ask questions, to interact, to share their thoughts and reflections about the stories that they heard. And so I'm going to stop sharing the screen, but I want to wrap up just with another thank you. And I hope that you've been able to see a little bit, just hearing from my mom and then hearing my story. Our experiences are different of the same story, the same legacy that we both carry. Not that one is better or worse or more or less than the other, they're different. And I am so honored to be able to share this space with my mom and to share with you the resource that we have of being able to share grandchildren as a way to carry on the legacy of what our families went through and to turn our grandparents' hardship and suffering into some sort of lesson to help future generations. So with that, I'm gonna stop and look and open up to any questions. I know we have a couple of minutes before the next session, but I want to thank you all for listening. And I will stick around if people do have any questions that they would like to chat about. And also a reminder, because Jeff mentioned that today's session is really about civic engagement as a way to prevent what our families went through. It's election day, so if you haven't yet, when you're done with this session today, please go vote. Thank you.
Thank you, Paula. Thank you, Dave. That was very moving, very touching. You know, again, when you get the personal story in that, it really brings it alive. It really brings it home. While we're waiting for some questions to come in, I want to ask. First of all, I want to thank you both for this fantastic presentation, and it really hit on all three themes of what we're talking about today. You know, La Door Vador, civic engagement, and this idea of community. So thank you so much for that. But Dave, tell me a little bit more. I mean, it's wonderful that you've got 3G New York. This is a national conference. We've got people watching from all over the country. So let's say there's somebody in Texas, there's somebody in Arizona, there's somebody in California that wants to take advantage of this. How do they go about doing that? You say there's local chapters?
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. So we are connected with 3G organizations around the country. and there are in many metropolitan areas, there are organizations that bring 3Gs together as a way to connect and support each other, and also learn how to tell our stories and educate others. So depending on where you're located, there may be 3Gs who we have worked with or that we can connect you with who can come for in-person presentations. And then again, the benefit of everyone being familiar with Zoom and Google Meet and Teams and all those platforms is that our speakers are now able to speak literally anywhere. And over the past year, we've had speakers from New York, from Boston, from Canada, speaking in Montana, in Texas, in Canada, in Australia. So if no matter where you are, we can certainly accommodate virtually and quite possibly also connect you with some local in-person resources as well.
Wonderful. That's wonderful. Yeah, because this is something that's all over. This is something that each community has a need for this, and I think it's wonderful that you're able to make that available. Do we have any idea how many survivors are actually left? And I don't necessarily know if you would know this, Dave or Paula, but I wonder if anybody, if we have a concept of how many folks we have left. Any ideas, Dave?
No, I don't know. That's a good question. I know that almost daily, it seems like we see people posting about losing another survivor or a loved one who is passing on. So I know that, I don't know what the number is right now, but I know that it's getting smaller by the day, unfortunately.
Yeah, maybe
a lot of the survivors who are left are going to be, at this point, child survivors. There's a large, not a large number, but there were children who survived. There were children who were on the kinder transport who survived. There's actually a wonderful movie about some kids who were sent to England. I don't remember the name of it, and a reunion that they have as senior citizens. But I think the survivors of the camps are much, the numbers are depleting every day, unfortunately.
Yeah. We've got a couple questions in the chat. Would you like to take a shot at those, you guys?
Sure. Yeah, thank you for those questions. Where was it? Somebody was asking about recommendations for educators who get emotional while telling their grandparents' stories, and kind of tailored in with Debbie's question about oh no, sorry, Becca, about what type of details to divulge. So when we work with grandchildren to shape their story and figure out how to share it, that's a question that often comes up because it's emotional, it's personal. And people sometimes are hesitant to be vulnerable in that way in front of students. And what I can tell you is that being honest and open is the best way to connect with students and help them understand what you're experiencing. So obviously we don't want to just sob our way through a story, but there are, in every single time that I have told my grandmother's story to students, I have gotten choked up every time. The interesting thing is that I've gotten choked up at a different point in the story each time. I can never predict what's going to get me that day. And I think just being able to be real with kids, saying, you know what, this is really hard, even though it was my grandmother and it happened a long time ago, she's really important to me. And it is hard to talk about these horrible things that happened to her. So we really don't shy away from too many topics or details. Like I said, most of our audiences are middle school and high school. When we get to upper elementary school, we maybe try to filter out the most gory details. But as I'm sure you all know, kids are sort of inoculated with lots of violent images and rhetoric and descriptions. And so that part is not necessarily the thing that we are concerned about. It's more about finding a way to build that emotional connection. I will say one thing, we do kind of steer people away from talking about sexual violence, because that brings up a whole other level of trauma and story potentially. But being able to be real and describe people being killed, because that's what happened. And that's the horror of this whole episode, is that really bad things happen. So doing that in a way that is not, we're not trying to shock and scare anybody, but trying to connect and help them understand the enormity and the reality of what happened.
One question was whether my mother's story is available digitally. And actually, I do have a digital copy of it. And Jeff, if you would like, I can send it to you and you can load it up on the website or do whatever you want with it.
That would be wonderful. Thank you. That would be wonderful.
Because there's a copy at the U.S. Holocaust Museum and all of the other Holocaust museums. So she would be very happy to have it up there.
That'd be great. That would be wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, I just want to echo, you know, what Dave said. You know, the emotion is part of it. You know, the emotion brings in the reality. It brings in the authentic learning experience. And although it can be, you know, it can be scary and it can be overwhelming, it also can be really enlightening and really make that connection. So, you know, as you tear up and choke up, I mean, that's, you know, you've done exactly the right thing. You just got to keep pushing through. You've got to keep pushing through and pass that generation on to the information on to the next generation. Well, thank you so much, you guys. Dave and Paula Reckos, you guys are just doing a fantastic job, and we want to thank you for being a part of this today and for answering questions, sharing the story, making the resource available. And you know, I'm sure there'll be folks reaching out to you for your services. You're doing a great job with what you're doing, and we really appreciate it. So we're going to give folks about 5 minutes to take a break, and then we'll be back with the next session, and we'll go from there.